So today I'm going to be going over a tutorial for creating a turret in Halo 5 Forge. So a long time ago I put out a video with a working prototype turret that I made. I put out prefab links. Turns out I may have deleted the map when I purged my file share, and on top of that, it wasn't very helpful to people wanting to understand more about how and exactly why it worked. Scripting in Halo 5, in my opinion, has unlimited possibilities, and we have only scratched the surface. Some of the best game modes that have come out and the gimmicks, they still only scratch the surface. They're only the top level of this iceberg that is scripting. And it's pretty simple, and scripting may seem very complex, but I want to break it down, start from scratch, and show you how scripting works. So, and specifically, the methods that we learned we can use to apply to scripting turrets, or anything that has to do with looking at a player or moving with a player, looking in the same player's direction, all of that good stuff. So I'm just gonna load up a map on Barrens because I like Barrens, and I know that starting from scratch, some of you guys out there are not gonna really like that, but I have received some requests for me to go through it from step one, like it's bare bones, you got nothing. How do you put together something like that? So it's a pretty cool process to go over. And discovering this a while ago, I don't want to say I discovered it, but the techniques here have been put together by the Scripters Guild, or the Scripting Guild, which I was a part of, a founding member of, back when Halo 5 was more relevant than it is today. But with Halo Infinite coming out and the Forge coming out 6 months after launch, I know that Halo 5, in a way, it's a shame, but it's gonna be left behind. Like, it's gonna be forgotten. And with everything that is still capable in this game, even though putting this tutorial out might not help many people, or it might not generate the experiences that a lot of players are gonna play, but at least this may be able to be applied in a similar way to Halo Infinite, unless Halo Infinite gives us more tools, all that stuff we've been asking for. So, from square one, first we're gonna put together the cage. So let's demonstrate what exactly we're trying to accomplish here. So we have simple cages and advanced cages, and in Forge, the advanced cage is only gonna collide with other advanced types and terrain. It's supposed to be used in situations where you don't want it to collide with an object. In this situation, we don't want it to collide with anything, so we want to use the advanced cage and ball. So we're gonna spawn the ball, we're gonna spawn in the cage as well. So at a fundamental level, and I love using that word, the cage is an object that holds the ball, but this ball is going to be free to rotate in the cage in like a 360-degree manner. If I set this to normal physics, attach something to it, it's going to kind of fall down because the cage holds it. We can weaponize that. We can use that to our advantage. So if we have another, we could even use Script Brain, but for the sake of demonstration purposes, I'm going to use another ball. So using the snap, as you can see in the top left, you just press right in the D-pad to access and switch through it. So using snap 4, we know that this object is 4 feet away from this object. And we know because we've basically gone up, down, left, right, made sure that it is on the global axis and it's perfectly on a coordinate. And this one is going to be 4 away. We're going to give this one a boundary, the cylinder, with some radius, and and a height. Now what this is this is essentially the barrel. Whenever something is in view, we want our turret eventually to be able to shoot whatever's inside of it, you know, whatever it's looking at. Because in a way, it's a hacky way to do it, but it works. Because we know that the turret, like if I'm standing here and the turret's aiming that way, it shouldn't shoot at me. The turret first must look at me, and then it should be able to shoot me. So that's the idea. That's why we need this to have a boundary. 100 seems good enough for the purpose of demonstration. Obviously, it can be whatever you want, but later on, if you try to have a turret that has a range of like 1,000 feet, it may not be precise enough. The boundary may need to be larger in order to accommodate for your lost precision, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So you have this object attached. Well, we're about to. So now here's the cool thing. So now if we weld these together, and we selected this one first, so this one becomes the parent. That's very important, because in scripting, if I script this using a very simple script, we're just going to do a timer, and we're going to have it repeat as fast as possible, so once every 20th of a second. And we're going to have it move itself, so this towards players. Really simple. I'll leave it at probably 50. If you haven't moved too fast, what can happen is it can break out of the cage, because when if I set this normal physics and try really hard to push it against the cage, it probably won't move, because the monitor can only move things at a certain like velocity. But when you script something to move, it's going to move at that whatever velocity it takes to move to that target within that amount of time, which depending on where your target is, if I'm right here, it's going to freak out probably and not have a good time. It might pop out, kind of like your arm getting thrown out of your shoulder. Don't throw out your shoulder. So anyways, once we've scripted this to move, we want to make sure it's set to normal physics, because otherwise it's going to fall out. And then look at that. So what is happening here? Because if we had one of these, and let's just for the sake of demonstration to isolate it, let's say we have this. When it moves, it should just do that, right? It should just move towards the player. Well, remember, we put a cage around part of it. So when we end up moving it, let's delete this script so it doesn't freak out. I'll just duplicate this. I love duplicating stuff. So attach this to that. Now, when we try to move this on normal physics towards the player, we'll turn off. Look at that. So when it tries to move, the joint holds it. Now, there's a few problems with this approach. Number one, when there's no active players in the area, it falls straight down. And if the player is right above the turret, it's 360 degrees. So if I go below, it can go all the way around. There aren't many turrets I know that has that degree of flexibility. You know what I mean? So this works well as a prototype, but to get something more realistic, we're gonna need to use some we're gonna need to use multiple joints. So now, and that's gonna be a glitch sometimes when an object moves through the use of scripting. It's gonna want to disappear in Forge. You just need to select one of the child objects and move it around, and it should reappear. because it's normally invisible during gameplay like that. So we're going to turn scripting off. We're gonna set it back to phase. It's already set. So this is how you can, so you might be thinking, isn't there a joint object that's a barrel that will only allow a joint to rotate on a 2D axis? And you'd be correct, except the cage is not perfectly the size of the joint, as in the cage is not a cylinder, rather it's a box. It's a rectangular box. So what ends up happening, get the hinge. What ends up happening is when we put this in here, notice how it falls down like that? And if we rotate it a little bit, it can rotate slightly up and down. Now this creates instability in our system because you don't want that to happen when the turret needs to rotate, where it looks like the turret's getting crooked and it's janky, and this is more prone to getting popped out because it can fall through the bottom under specific circumstances. So instead of using that, we want to use something very precise. So instead we'll just use 2 balls and 2 cages, and we'll make sure to weld the parent first, which the convention is to hit weld before you group them, because when you group objects it can slightly shift them. Weird glitches, I know, right? So now if we set this to normal, well, we also need to turn on scripting. It'll move, but now we have another problem. So it's moving fine, except you can notice because we're slightly below it, and because the top one is restricted from rotating it, like the front of it downwards towards the player, it can struggle a little bit to hold itself. So this won't work. What can we do from here, you know? Well, we go back to square one, kind of. Not really, but ignore what I did there because that was me accidentally doing stuff. I haven't been on here in a very long time. So god damn it. I accidentally deleted it. I'll just disable the boundary on this. Okay. So then, instead of worrying about that, about trying to put it into 2 boxes, what if, now hear this out, what if we had a floor? So there's another joint piece, which is a constraint, which is basically a rectangle that can use that it'll collide with. So if we put this strategically in a way, now I could move the joint closer so I don't have to make that much, but so now this ball, once we weld them together, turn on scripting, it'll be able to go down, kind of. Maybe a little bit buggy. but you get the general idea where to prevent it. Oops. It's going through it. Learning along with me. Let's try that. Yeah, it's just going through it. And for this reason, simple objects may be easier to use. I will try to use simple objects instead. And I think I had to use simple objects for that reason, or initially, and that's why the turret was made out of joint concealers, which I'm gonna go over here in a second. So simple cage, simple ball. Turn on this boundary. We don't need to go that far, but as you can already see, it's incredibly simple to create something like this from scratch. It doesn't require a lot of know-how. The only thing that really takes up time and effort is making it work with a map that has existing scripting. Because if you want it to do more complex things like a subroutine where you have a boundary in an area, and if a player enters that area, then the turret is activated, and then it will only shoot at a certain team, or if you allow a button to turn the turret on and off, you need to use channels for that. And that's when things get a little bit more difficult. So now, just leave that there and then get our joint constraints. Okay, here we go. Alright, I may be a bit slow, so I did not have to switch to simple, because the thing that scripters were really complaining about, at least from what I've realized back in the day, was how joint constraints only collide with other joint constraints. They don't collide at all with the joints they're supposed to hold. Instead, they created a special type of joint ball that collides with those joint constraints. Which is fine because we will just use this one instead. There we go. So now, if we weld this to this, the welded group will always inherit the properties of the parent object. It's been used multiple times, from what I remember, to allow certain objects that shouldn't have normal physics to have normal physics, which is pretty cool. The only downside to that is usually it's pretty broken, and then you run into problems down the line with the game, like crashing and stuff like that. Alright, so now we have our joint constraint that we wanted to use earlier. We'll put it right there. We'll make a nice little platform. It doesn't have to be many necessarily, but this is what your ceiling is, and your floor is for your turret's ability to aim. And it's never going to be glitchless. Like, you're always probably gonna have that rough edge whenever it comes to stuff like this in Halo 5, but at the very least it'll work. That's all that matters. So we're gonna have this move this towards players, Again, you probably want to filter more like players that are alive, that are tagged with a certain label provided by a boundary, whatever. This will work for now. You want it to be local because if it's... So, here's the cool thing, and I'm gonna put out another tutorial showing it. So you can attach flashlights to weapons without attaching them to a weapon. Like as in, it'll follow the weapon and then by virtue the player, when the player holds the weapon in their hand. It's pretty cool. But anyways, so we're done with that scripting. We're going to make sure it is set to normal. So the one thing I forgot to tell you about, it's fine. It should be fine. So it turns out that when it aims at a player, and this is a good thing to know for the future, when it aims at the player, it's not actually aiming at the player. It's like it's aiming at the base point that that player entity defines as here is the player, which is turns out to be the ground right below the player. So the player entity, it starts at like a point right between the feet. That can be a problem when you have a turret because if it's just aiming at their feet, it's not really aiming at them. So usually I just throw in about 4 feet. Spartan's like 8 feet, and that's what gets it to be centered on the Spartan. And then set it back to normal. So now it's aiming straight through me. If I open machinima mode, I could have it aim a bit higher. So now if I go around, does a pretty decent job of aiming. There's some Halo 5 stuff. And now it can't aim at me because of that floor, which as I said, I can move that floor to be higher. And then as I was saying, it can be a bit glitchy, but that's Halo 5. So this is these are the fundamental mechanics that are involved. You have a cage that holds part of a welded object in place, which is going to be your joint constraint ball, and then whatever you want to use, whether it's simple or advanced, to hold this object in place. And this object is going to be scripted to move towards a player, but because it could never reach the player because the joint is holding it, this will point towards the player, and then by virtue of pointing towards the player, you have a boundary which you could have send a message channel, like a repeating message. And then you could have a power channel where if someone's in the boundary, it turns on a power channel, and then when someone's in this boundary, it sends a message channel. So on power and message, it'll take, let's say, and this is what I used before, was it'll take a fire effects because it's one of the only things that'll damage players' shields. Because you could do a scripted damage, like damage set, but a player as an entity, the health is what it'll damage. It won't damage the shields. Which is unfortunate, things that we want in Halo Infinite, obviously, as far as scripting goes, but I'm confident that the team's gonna take our expectations and completely fucking blow them out of the water. So what you do is you hide this in the turret. You can't really mute it or anything, whatever, right? And you're going to put a script on it that on whatever message it's gonna move towards that player very quickly. It's gonna this to players, probably want it to be activator actually, because activator, so here's the cool part about activator in scripting. So on message receive alpha, it's going to move this towards the activator. Who is the activator? Well, the activator is whatever this condition passes on. So you can chain the activator along for the ride, basically. So let's say, I'm going to turn off scripting so I can show some other stuff. So let's say with this one, right, it's going to move, and then we have another thing that says on boundary check continuous, because we want it to continuously send this message over and over and over again, as long as the player's still in the boundary, right? The turret's not going to just shoot one bullet and stop. So we probably want it to repeat every 1/5 of a second. We're going to have it send and then activate or transfer the activator. So it's going to be whoever triggers this, which is going to be a player. So player is going to enter the boundary. It's going to send alpha every 20th of a second. Then we go back to this one, and because it's receiving alpha and the activator along with it, it's going to move this towards the activator in a 1/10 of a second. And I don't care if it shoots for the feet, but whatever. We'll just have it move to the center mass. Now, after we do that, we don't want it to just we don't want it to chase the Spartan, because that doesn't look very realistic if it just sits on them. So we're going to actually have it reset position. Gonna have that position reset and reset everything, which gives it enough time, about another 1/10 of a second, for the next iteration to occur. So now if I leave that there, oh, scripting's off still. Oops. I may have made a mistake. This activator. We're gonna do wait just in case. We're gonna wait 1/10 of a second and then do the position reset. And then for that boundary, we're going to have it send that message every 25th of a second. Then probably want to make the boundary longer, just so that it'll work over a longer distance, and probably make the boundary a bit larger too. Which, whenever you I knew that was gonna happen. Whenever you make changes to an object with a boundary that's welded, you can't just change the boundary through this object properties. You have to basically re-rig it by resetting position and setting it back in here. Yep. And then we can unweld it and ungroup and turn off scripting. Make sure it's phased. And then now we can go to this one and change the stuff. This can become very complex and frustrating when you have more complex contraptions, which start eating up a lot of time, because now every time you go to test and iterate, you have to fix it. Some things require a lot of precision, which, as I said, for the weapon, like adding flashlights to weapon and all that good stuff, it requires a lot of precision to do it correctly in a way that the Forge mode likes. It's kind of like back in Halo Reach, when people would make there was a good YouTube series about making the drop pods, like making drop pods. You just take like 2 barrier pieces and combine them together, and you have a series of explosives that, when triggered, will chain reaction and destroy an explosive that is right underneath a shield, like a 2-way shield. So the explosive is what's holding up the drop pod, but because it's on the other side of a shield, it doesn't damage the person inside the drop pod. So then when that finally explodes, drop pod can fall. It's pretty cool. Only problem is you needed to create them so precisely, otherwise it would break apart in action and just kill the player. Obviously you're supposed to use a jetpack, but come on, you know, how cool is it to just land in a drop pod and for it to break apart and for you to just go into battle, you know? So we take that, it's welded, set to normal, and scripting's on. So now it is having some issues finding me. It's okay. We can fix that. Now this is where you kind of have to tune it to go the speed you want it to, because if it goes too fast, then it's not really fair. If it goes too slow, then it's not dangerous. So now it is freaking out. So here's what I need to do. Turn off scripting and reset map state. Here's what I'm doing wrong. So we want this boundary continuous to actually trigger constantly. As this is technically not constant, but it's basically constant. And we want the smoke to have a trying to die again. Or not the smoke, the fire to have a move offset. It's basically instant. And instead of waiting, we're actually just gonna turn off condition interrupt. So now it shouldn't be interrupted, because I have a feeling that it's being interrupted, so it's not reaching the player every time. Now for more, there's a way, and this is a kind of cheating, but because the move offset is kind of slow, even though it's supposed to be 1/10 of a second, it's kind of slow. Sometimes we want to move it twice, and then maybe it'll work. So we're moving offset, move offset, and that way if it takes 2 steps to get there, it'll get there. Now we turn on scripting. So it's freaking out. I don't know why. I have a feeling it has to do with who it's targeting, what it's trying to target. So it's moving this towards players, but we want to select the nearest one. And we also, well, before we select, we want to filter first. So we want to filter out the dead, and then we select the nearest one. This is important because you don't want it to keep shooting at a dead player. As funny as it may be, it's not a very effective turret if it only kills one person. So now, turn scripting back on. And that's what I was talking about with it breaking out. Sometimes it can do that. And it is because it's moving way too fast towards the player. So we're gonna have this set back to 0.5. Now as you can see, Are you gonna reach me? Are you gonna get to me? Now, a lot of this deals with trial and error. It's not always gonna work out, and debugging can take a long time as well. As you can see, you know what? I think it's the flames. I think it's colliding with these. I can't be sure. Right now, it's just it's in here. Doesn't care. And like what I was talking about, when it moves, like it won't break if I spawn in here, but it will break when I spawn in here. And the reason is that the distance and the time it's been scripted to move to that distance in 0.5 seconds. So it doesn't care about the boundaries I've given it at that point. It's just gonna break out because within one tick it's gonna be from here to here. And the game won't register that. Whereas if it tries to move from there to there, the game's gonna be like, whoa, 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 and then push it back. Now if I spawn in here, might work better. It's like it's not even moving at all. Moves the activator. And getting this all done correctly also takes a bit of time too. I've also made another discovery, or at least have another idea of what's going wrong here. We're gonna try to fix it. So basically, and this is a bad habit, try not to do. Whenever you script a welded group, it'll apply the same script to all objects in that group. So what do you think is happening when I script this to boundary check for players and I send a message with the activator? And one of the objects doesn't have a boundary at all. Maybe the game interprets that as a whole map is a boundary, and then maybe it's duplicating and sending some garbled stuff. So I don't know if that's true, but we're gonna turn off scripting and weld it on group. Then delete that script from this object. And as long as those two first scripts are the same, they'll work together. The only downside, as I said, is that you're gonna have to rig it multiple times over and over and over again. Can be annoying. The closest it's got to killing me, but it's only hurting me when I enter the boundary. So this is when you have to get a bit creative. So the fix to this is using more complicated scripting. And it doesn't make sense, but it's just the way it is. So instead of doing a boundary check, we're gonna do a timer, which you can replace this with a message that gets sent on a timer. It doesn't matter, but so we're gonna do timer check, and we're gonna set the number of the object, this object, and we're gonna set it, and we're gonna force 30, and I'll explain that in a second, to the object count of players, boundary this include, and we're going to exclude the dead as I said. That exclude, let's look nearest, if there is one. So this number will either be 0 or 1, depending on whether there's a player in the boundary, 1, or not in the boundary, 0. And this value we could use to add to it to make it 1 or 2, or -1 or 0, no point. So we don't need to randomize for this. Now force 30, what that does is for our next script, well, we won't have it on this one, so I'm gonna weld these together. What force 30 does is if you have an object that has a number check, which I've realized my blunder here is that instead of this changing an object number, I have to set it to a global channel. But I'll explain the same thing. But so you can set any other object's number, but you can only check your own number, which doesn't make sense, and it's something that we've complained about too for Halo 5. Yeah, so we're gonna set to object count, players add, boundary this include, and then dead exclude, then select nearest one. Alright, so we're gonna change the alpha, force 30, then we're gonna weld these back together. Now this one, instead of doing a channel, we're basically filtering that timer so that when the timer triggers and that number gets updated to equal 1, which it's gonna, if the player stays in the boundary, it's gonna trigger every time the timer goes off, since force 30 is on. Then we're gonna move this to the player, which we're just gonna do players add extra. Let me figure out what extra is. Extra transfer objects with modified variables that pass the condition. I forgot about that. We're not gonna use that. Players add, select nearest one, dead exclude. And then, just for the sake of the next one, I'm gonna have to copy this over to the next one. Players add. That excludes like nearest one. Condition interrupt is off, which is good. Now what I like to do when I start getting really like on and off with testing, like I'm just constantly testing stuff, I like to keep a copy of whatever iteration I'm on. That way if I completely screw it up, it's not completely screwed. So scripting's off, so it'll stay by itself. I'm going to enable scripting on that, on this, and set it to normal. So now it's hitting me a lot more. It's weird, and my game is also lagging. And the servers can be kind of wonky too. Like it knows to aim straight at me, but it's been aiming to the side of me. So now I've demonstrated it's able to kill a player using some, I don't want to call it complex, but it's inefficient scripting. That's what I'll call it, because the main issue is that you're using up channels, you're using up stuff that maybe you need to use it for other things, or maybe they're already being used. So there are probably more efficient ways to do this, but off the top of my head, to make this work, it's the way this works. And you might be thinking, well then, what about the rest of the turret? What about the exterior, all that stuff? Well, basically, because the joint concealers are massless, you can put, and this is the easiest part, you can put a joint concealer cylinder like that, boom, and then you weld the pipe to that contraption as I was talking about. So basically you'd weld this here, and you'd still script it the same way where the ball moves and the whole object moves, but this ball is still the parent, and then this joint will move with it. It'll look like the turret's pointing at things, looking at stuff. And then you script this fire effects along with contrail effects. And the contrail effects basically makes a squiggly line through the air that looks like a bullet when it shoots. Then you could also have it when that number change happens, or after that movement happens, whatever, that it plays a sound to the player which makes it sound like the machine guns are going off, which is like the you know, sound. I mean, that's my best impression of it. Let's find it. We're almost there. Thrusters, stabilizer, contrail. So now, basically, when this moves through the air, they've basically attached this to your Spartans in Halo Infinite in the tech preview. If you've noticed, when you're running, you just see that. Yes, this is gonna move towards and forward and back constantly, which kind of looks like bullet trails. It's primitive, but it works, like many things. There are other things you could do to make this work better, adjust the settings, find different ways to trigger the actual looking towards the player, and maybe allow that to work smoother. Plenty of things that can be done, however, this is what I've accomplished, and hopefully this helps a lot of you understand exactly how it was done and help you out with your future scripting endeavors. So that's all I have for this. Yeah.